Hi there and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Kapelos in Ottawa on this Wednesday. Tonight, Quebec's Premier quits.
Many Quebecers are hoping and wanting a change in Premier.
Twice elected with majority governments, François Legault steps down as Quebec Premier, facing massively eroding public polling support in this election year as the separatist Parti Québécois surges. We're going to break down his legacy and how his departure could influence both provincial and national politics in moments with Tom Mulcair and our Quebec Bureau Chief Geneviève Beauchemin. Then, interprovincial booze battle.
Sure as I'm talking to you, that Crown Royal is coming off the shelves.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford plans to pull Manitoba-made Crown Royal from shelves in his province. Premier Wab Canoe will join our show with his case to keep the rye whiskey's biggest customer. That's coming up. And then eyes on Iran.
Does this mean military action is now off the table against Iran?
We're going to watch and see what the process is.
Donald Trump appears for the first time in days to downplay the possibility of U.S. military intervention as the Iranian regime continues its internet blackout in the brutal suppression of protesters. We're going to bring in one of Canada's last representatives to Iran, Dennis Horak, on the volatile situation. That's coming up a little bit later on in the show. First, though. We're going to start tonight in the province of Quebec, which this evening is down a premier.
For the good of my party, and especially for the good of Quebec, I am announcing today that I will be resigning my position as the Premier of Quebec.
Coalition Avenir Quebec founder François Legault quits after more than 7 years in office with two back-to-back majority governments. The Premier, once Canada's most popular in public opinion polling, has seen rapidly and steadily declining support as the separatist Parti Québécois rides a wave of political momentum ahead of the province's election next fall.
He has led a government through crucial moments and very challenging times, and we can think about the pandemic. He left his mark in Quebec politics, and for sure, with the decisions that he made, he shaped the future of Quebec.
We've never seen a government so unpopular, so I think that he made the right decision for himself and for Quebec. That being said, when somebody leaves, usually we commend them a bit. He was able to get Quebec out of the constitutional fights for a decade, and that's not something small. He was able to have all Quebecers, no matter if you're a separatist or a federalist, work together.
Despite his initial popularity, Legault, as you heard in those clips, does have a mixed record, seeing the province, yes, through COVID-19, also invoking the notwithstanding clause twice for his law banning public sector employees from displaying religious symbols, and his 2021 language law. Here's a look at his time in office.
Never be a referendum with the Coalition Avenir Québec. Never in the life of the coalition, even after 10 years, even after 20 years.
Today, we have marked history.
Don't worry about food. You may worry about getting the coronavirus, but don't worry about getting food next week or the week after. It's important we change the way we pay doctors to put incentives to give better services to Quebecers.
With us now to talk about the wider implications of François Legault's resignation in an election year in Quebec, CTV News Quebec Bureau Chief Geneviève Beauchemin is here, and CTV News political analyst, as well as former Quebec Liberal MNA and Minister Tom Mulcair. Hello to both of you. Thanks so much for making the time. Tom, I'll start with you because I'm having a bit of deja vu. Just a few weeks ago, we were at this time on this very program talking about the resignation of Liberal leader Pablo Rodriguez. Yep. My first question to you at the time was, did he have any other choice? I'll ask the same one in this instance. Did Premier Legault have any other choice?
No, he had no other choice. And I had written several articles saying as much, that he would be gone early in the new year. He tried everything. He hit every button on his dashboard because there were red flashing lights everywhere all fall. Tried to go after the unions, had a big fight with the doctors. He was blaming people, as was his wont. But, he's served his whole life. He worked in the private sector first, actually, but he's worked most of the last 30 years serving the public. So I think he deserves recognition and thanks for that. But his government never delivered. He said it was going to be a government of accountants. We have a massive deficit here in Quebec. The schools are full of mold and mildew. the healthcare system's falling apart, and he was at 15 to 18% in the polls. And it looked like the separatist Parti Québécois was going to rebound and suddenly form a government. Well, that's all being, brought back to reality now. The Parti Québécois, it does not necessarily have that much of a chance of winning the next election if the non-separatist forces can get their act together and start talking to each other. I noticed Éric Duhaime was one of the people in your clips there before, the head of the Conservative Party. He's about 12, 14% in the polls. The Liberals are mid-20s. The 65% that don't want separation, don't want another referendum, are split amongst 4 different parties. And so that's the big trick right now. How do you bring and coalesce those parties and bring them back together again? And I think that Legault did something unique, because for 2 generations, Quebec politics was all about federalist versus separatist, not a question of economic vision or even social vision. It was a constitutional divide. It's a fake divide. So now people are going to have to ask themselves whether they want to continue with the fight between sovereignist and federalists, or they want to go to a system that's more in lockstep with what happens in the rest of Canada. Are you going to have a vision for the economy and for your social programs? And is that what you're going to be able to put forward? Legault's party, I think, is sunk without him. They'll put up a new leader, but I don't think they'll have much of a chance. And the Liberals are resurgent. They've got a young leader who's replacing Pablo Rodriguez. His name is Charles Milliard. He's more like the Robert Bourassa type. So I think everything is being rewritten right now in Quebec politics. And what a first 2 weeks of a year we've had. I mean, everything that's gone on internationally, south of the border, and now here in Canada, and we're not even halfway through January.
As for the particulars, Geneviève, of what led to this moment, because I know Quebecers will be intimately familiar with all the various controversies that the Premier found himself in, but for those outside of the province, ultimately, what was it that forced his hand, do you think?
Well, it's really hard to pinpoint exactly what it was, because it was a series of flip-flops, a series of crises that he had to deal with throughout his second mandate, really. I was reflecting to the fact that really in November 2023, he was dealing with something that was a bit unusual. He had paid millions of dollars to bring the LA Kings here to Quebec City to play here. And there was a backlash in the population. This was on the verge of the public sector strikes, those going on strike. We're talking about the fact that, hey, we have money to bring NHL players to this province here when we could have it for free. And they're coming, we're paying for this while we're needing more salary increases. This is completely disconnected. And at the time, it was striking to me that the Legault government was unable to really kind of quiet that kind of talk, that kind of criticism over hockey, really. And it just continued after that. There were a series of other issues that came to the table. The digitization of the Quebec Automobile Insurance Board services, really, there was cost overruns that were just massive. There was an inquiry over that. There were also a number of issues leading to questions about secularism, where there were laws that were brought into place that were controversial and that many people had been talking about. So it really is something that was a momentum that had been building over months and months, and in fact, years and years. It sort of started with he had all this in his back pocket, this credibility, the affection of Quebecers, but over time really lost the confidence of Quebecers. It was evident on the streets of Montreal today, talking to people. People are saying it was about time. It is time to have change. And now that's interesting. It's something that Legault has been telling Quebecers, don't focus entirely on change, really focus on issues like the French language and on the economy. But really, when you talk to Quebecers, they say, we've had enough of this. We need something new.
Do you have a gut feeling, Tom? I heard you reference earlier a Christmas card that the Premier wrote to you, in which he was saying he was going to try to kind of fight the fight, and a few weeks later, we obviously see a very different conclusion was reached.
I brought it with me to show it to you.
Oh, you did? Inside, let's zoom right in. Can you hold it up? Yeah.
Sure. Here's the Christmas card. Joyeux Noël. But here's what he said inside the card, and this was a bit of a. For me, this was a bit of a giveaway. He said, Cher Thomas, dear Tom, I'm going to translate. In 2026, I'm going to try to prove you wrong. In French, he said, je vais essayer de faire mentir. So essayer, to try was the key word in there. Because if he wanted to stick around till the next election, which I said he was not going to do, all he had to do was stick around to the next election. Why did he have to try to do that? And I think that that was the key. He had already looked at the lay of the land. He had looked at the polling. He had tried every trick in the book in the fall to change the numbers. They just weren't changing. And it was interesting. It was he was showing a lot of abnegation. He stood in front of the cameras and he said, look, I've had to take a proper assessment here. The party's not doing well because of me. Quebecers want change. I can't be that change. They also want to change premiers. I've got to step aside, otherwise the party. And he founded this party. He created it out of nothing. So there's never been a leadership race, by the way, before. They're about to have their very first leadership race. And he was just saying, look, I realized that all could be lost, all what he believed in, which was neither federalist nor separatist. Let's have a decent government and stop talking about breaking up the country. So that brought a lot of people into the CAQ fold. It's still a bit bizarre that there's a party called the CAQ, but let's leave that aside for a second. He brought a lot of people to go along with him, and he won 2 strong mandates, and that's remarkable as a political accomplishment. But the results just weren't there. Geneviève referenced big projects. There was one called the Third Link, a new bridge or tunnel or whatever between Quebec City and the South Shore, which was desperately needed. They talked about it for 4 years, and then once they got their second mandate, they unceremoniously canceled it and said they hadn't really done anything to plan around this. They got creamed in a by-election in Quebec City, and it's been downhill for them all the way since then. He lost 2 key ministers when he started his fight with the doctors. These were people that had been loyal to him since day one. One was a doctor, one was his health minister. They both quit. And then he was just alone. Yesterday, and it's not a coincidence, yesterday a devastating report about what Geneviève mentioned, hundreds of millions of dollars thrown out the window on a new computer system at the Automobile Insurance Board. There was no way. There was nothing left for him to do except step down. It's always hard to watch because you know that he has worked so hard, but it was inevitable in my view.
A final question to you, Geneviève, about something that Tom raised the specter of, and that is, of course, I think the question that the rest of Canada is very keenly interested in, the prospect of a referendum, right? A few months ago or a few weeks ago when we were talking about the dominance of the PQ in the polls, this sort of interesting juxtaposition existed where public opinion polling shows a majority of Quebecers do not want to separate at this juncture, particularly with the advent of this iteration of Trump. But at the same time, the PQ leader is promising very specifically to hold a referendum on the subject. How much does this, in combination with now a Liberal leadership race in the province, kind of throw things into a tailspin or cast more doubt on what was feeling like an eventuality in this fall's election?
Well, it really does shake things up, and Tom alluded to that as well. It really is now just a big shift in the political landscape that we've been looking at for the last few months. Is it when François Legault was first campaigning, I went with him in the early days of his first political campaign here in Quebec, and he was talking about setting aside that federalist, separatist divide, the fights of the old days. He was calling it, he was saying this is all gone, where I'm going to focus on something else. There were a lot of doubters, people saying, as Tom was saying, in this province, this has been the lay of the land. We've been fighting. We've been sort of putting up these 2 parties against one another, and it's always the talk. And then over the years, that went away. But the polls have been saying there were, under Legault, people were really not. He did set that aside for a number of years. There is this talk about the referendum, and this is the kind of dilemma that we've seen in Quebec so many times, over and over again. People are willing to vote for a party that supports a referendum on sovereignty, even though they don't want a referendum on sovereignty. And it sounds a little bit wacky in so many ways, but it is the fact that people here say they're looking at other issues, especially when they were looking at the political landscape before. Who were they going to vote for? There was a Liberal Party that was in disarray. There was issues that they were looking at with their leadership campaign. They were looking at Legault, they felt was a man that was not the man for the job. He had lost the confidence of Quebecers. And there was the Conservative Party, which has not been that popular here. So it really was a bit of a choice as where to look for. And they were looking to this young leader, Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon. They were saying, well, this could be a leader that could take Quebec into the next generation. They were looking about the fact that he was really sort of projecting a new image. Now, he was still talking, vowing to have that referendum, and that it was a bit of an issue. Many people saying, well, you know, I understand, I don't want a referendum, but I'll vote for him. Now things are changed. There is going to be a new leader, and it doesn't, as Tom was saying, it doesn't mean that the CAQ will itself be revitalized by that leadership campaign, but it does change the lay of the land, and that'll be interesting to look at how things will align over the next few months. There's not that much time. You know, the election is in October, so it will have to be pretty speedy to replace, you know, the leader of the opposition, the premier, and get all the cards to fall into place some way here in Quebec.
Yeah, a lot of excitement in an election year. Thanks to both of you for sharing your analysis tonight. Appreciate it, as always. Geneviève Beauchemin and Tom Mulcair, appreciate it. We're going to dig even further into the political stakes of Legault's departure just a little bit later on in the show with an all-Quebec edition of our Front Bench. Louis Hammond, Dimitri Soudis, and Sébastien Dallaire will all be here. First, though, Donald Trump dials down his rhetoric on U.S. military intervention in Iran for the first time, saying, quote, killings have stopped without providing any evidence. We're going to bring in one of Canada's last representatives to Iran after a short break on what may come next.
Ron, you said that the killing has stopped. Who told you that the killings have stopped?
We have been informed by very important sources on the other side, and they've said the killing has stopped and the executions won't take place.
Does this mean military action is now off the table against Iran?
We're going to watch and see what the process is, but we were given a very good statement by people that are aware of what's going on.
U.S. President Donald Trump speaking in the Oval Office this afternoon, and for the first time in days downplaying his threat to intervene in Iran. Without citing any evidence, Trump claimed to understand the killings in Iran had stopped, and from sources, he said, there would not be, quote, executions today. Now, human rights advocates say at least 2,400 protesters have been killed by the country's theocratic regime as it executes a brutal crackdown on demonstrators. Joining us now is Denis Horak. He was one of Canada's last representatives to Iran before diplomatic ties were severed. He served as charge d'affaires from 2009 to 2012. Hi, Mr. Horak. Good to see you. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
It was definitely, something to note to hear the president speak in those terms versus the way he has the previous few days. And I'll be totally transparent. All the analysis I've read has at times been contradictory. I see, some analysis that says, well, there aren't enough U.S. assets in place in order to strike Iran in the way that the president had described. So maybe he's just buying time. And then I see other analysis that says, look, the U.S. partners in the area were not supportive of opening up their airspace, for example, or of those military strikes. So likely he's just finding a way to back down from the initial threat. What does your gut tell you? What is your initial analysis of why he's saying this now?
Well, I think those are very viable possibilities, and all things can be true. I think also, I understand he got a military briefing, I think earlier this week. They may have advised him, quite rightly in my view, that what would be the objective of these military strikes? What would they be trying to do? How would that help the protesters? It was never clear to me what would happen that would make the protesters more successful by military strikes in Iran. There was talk about taking out the leadership, talk about taking out the security forces. And then what? We saw what happens when you try and change regimes by the air. We've seen that in Libya. I just don't see how that would have been a viable option in any case, and perhaps they're trying to walk that back now.
What kind of scale of intervention would be necessary in order to lead to the fall of the regime? Because you bring up a very salient point, right? Which is ultimately what these protesters are protesting is the behavior of the regime. So if the regime stays in place, then ultimately what is the purpose of the strikes? Like, is there a level of intervention that you think could essentially force the removal of the regime?
It's really hard to see what that would be. You could take out the leadership. You could take out headquarters for the Revolutionary Guard, the Basiji militia, other elements of security forces, attack police stations, as they've said, and basically unleash anarchy. And then what? I don't know where that would lead. And would that be just in Tehran? Would that be across the country? What would that look like? What would the day after look like? I just don't see the viability of a military option in settling this. This would be How it's settled will ultimately be decided within Iran.
Can I also ask you about the relative grip on power that the regime has right now? I mean, you're intimately familiar with the regime's power over Iran over a long course of time. There's been changes in the region, obviously, via a lot of their proxies. Like, would you assess their grip on power to be less than it was, let's say, for example, even in 2022 at the time of the last series of protests of this scale?
Well, I think certainly their sense of invincibility, this sort of image of invincibility, has been taking a big blow over the past couple of years, and what sort of impact that has psychologically within the society is hard to measure, but I think certainly it would have an impact. But that being said, the security forces in Iran are ruthless, as we've seen over the past couple of weeks, and they seem to be still in place and able to lash out as and when they want. Whether they're in fact have stopped the killings, as the president says, or not, I mean, the information is very unclear at this point because of blackouts and various things, but certainly images that are coming out suggested that it's still a pretty brutal place. And they retain that power, they retain that brutality. And so insofar as that enhances their grip on society, which I think it does, then they're still in pretty good shape. But these demonstrations, I think, will add to pressure to do something different, to change the direction, that the status quo that has been in place for ages has to be revisited, because this is just going to keep happening and happening. I think the regime knows that. Whether they're capable of making the kind of changes necessary to deal with some of the grievances remains to be seen.
What does the blackout itself, this ability of the regime to essentially, make it so that no information can get out of Iran and that people can't communicate with each other, what does it tell you about what they're capable of?
It's kind of ironic, because modern communications allows for much better coordination than obviously decades ago when the Iranian Revolution happened in '79. Information from the Ayatollah, who was in exile, was sent by a cassette tape. Now things are much more sophisticated and much more effective in terms of coordination and getting information around. By the same token, it's much easier to cut them off too, that you can have basically flip a switch essentially and you can cut communications. And it makes it much more difficult for organizers and others who are accustomed to dealing with an electronic world to deal with an analog world.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. Mr. Horak, thanks so much for your insights this evening. Appreciate it as always.
My pleasure.
Thank you. Dennis Horak was Canada's former charge d'affaires to Iran from 2009 to 2012. Also coming out of the White House today, a Danish delegation met with top U.S. administration officials as the president continues to take aim at their sovereignty over Greenland, arguing they need the U.S. to defend the Arctic territory. Ahead of the meeting, the White House posted this cartoon to social media suggesting Denmark has to choose between America and China and Russia. Following the meeting, Denmark's foreign minister said the governments have agreed to disagree.
The Kingdom of Denmark continues to believe that also the long-term security of Greenland can be ensured inside the current framework. We therefore still have a fundamental disagreement, but we also agree to disagree. And therefore we will, however, continue to talk. We have decided to form a high-level working group to explore if we can find a common way forward.
Denmark's take on the meeting and those comments were then put to U.S. President Donald Trump. Have a listen to his response.
I can't rely on Denmark being able to fend themselves off. You know, they were talking about they put an extra dog, and they were serious about this. They put an extra dog sled there last month. They added a second dog sled. That's not going to do the trick. I have a very good relationship with Denmark, and we'll see how it all works out. I think something will work out.
Meanwhile, as all of that unfolds, Prime Minister Mark Carney has touched down in China. The Prime Minister kicking off a state visit there, set to meet with top Chinese officials before sitting down with President Xi Jinping on Friday. The government says it's time for a reset as China pushes for Canada to drop electric vehicle tariffs in exchange for removing their tariffs on Canadian canola and other agricultural products. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand spoke with reporters on the impetus for Canada's renewed interest in a China reset. Have a listen.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how that change in context has forced Canada to recalibrate its relationship with China? And can I also like the challenge of doing that while you're trying to renegotiate CUSMA?
The economic order is becoming rewired. As a result of that rewiring, Canada has taken a number of steps under Prime Minister Carney, diversifying supply chains and trading partners.
But can you tell me how it led to coming here to China?
With the world's largest economies.
On the other side of a quick break, we'll turn back to our top story. What does the resignation of Quebec's premier mean for the province and national politics? Our front bench will be here in just 2 minutes to talk about that. Stay tuned.
Never be a referendum with the Coalition Avenir Québec. Never in the life of the coalition, even after 10 years, even after 20 years.
Today, we have marked history.
Don't worry about food. You may worry about getting the coronavirus, but don't worry about getting food next week or the week after. It's important we change the way we pay doctors to put incentives to give better services to Quebecers.
Some highlights there from François Legault's time in office after the premier resigned this morning. Have a listen.
For the good of my party, and especially for the good of Quebec, I am announcing today that I will be resigning my position as the Premier of Quebec.
It is an election year in Quebec, and François Legault saw his popularity plummet as the Parti Québécois support surged, stalking fears of another Quebec separation referendum. With us now on the potential political fallout of today's resignation is a special edition of our front bench. Louis Hammond was a senior advisor to Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne. Dimitri Soudas is former communications director to Prime Minister Stephen Harper, now a strategic advisor at TACT. And Sébastien Dallaire is an executive vice president at Leger for Eastern Canada. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. Thanks so much for making the time. Sébastien, I'll start with you. Paint a picture, if you could, for all of our viewers, both in and outside of Quebec, of just how bad things got for Mr. Legault.
It's been a struggle for the CAQ in polls for now better part of 2 years, and the PQ has been running high in the polls, been steadily in the lead, especially among Francophone voters, and it has been very difficult for François Legault himself to really try to change the channel and really generate more positive discussions about his party over the past couple of years, but especially in recent months. There have been many attempts pushing a very aggressive agenda during the fall, trying to talk more about Quebec identity. We also heard about picking fights with various stakeholders, including doctors, but nothing has really turned the dial up for the government. So in essence, the premier decided that maybe now was that time to go.
It's interesting, Dimitri, because sometimes when politicians are under fire, they try to fly under the radar, right? Like as their numbers are sinking, they're not trying to make a lot of news. But to Sebastian's point, the premier was taking a lot of shots, but they appeared to backfire. Why do you think that was?
Because Quebecers stopped listening. And I would pinpoint the exact moment where that happened. So the Quebec government, prior to getting elected, François Legault had promised, come hell or high water, that he would build a third link between Quebec City and the South Shore of Quebec City. And after many iterations of this project, they ended up abandoning it. And that sent a message, not just to the Quebec City area, but throughout Quebec, that the value of his promises no longer meant anything. And I would say that most of his policies, whether it's his economic policies, whether it's secularism in Quebec, are actually popular public policy positions. But when voters simply stop listening to you, and when voters decide that your word is no longer worth the paper it is written on, you end up being, and you know, Jean-Marc Léger, the head pollster, the president of Léger Marketing, said it best today. François Legault will have been both the best and the worst premier in Quebec's history in terms of popular support.
To what degree does this, Louis, in your view, upend the what might have been envisioned to be a probable outcome of this year's election? Like, how much does this shake things up?
Well, it does shake things up because this is quite a bombshell. I mean, you know, despite the rumors that have been sort of circulating about François Legault pulling the plug before the fall election, I don't think anybody sort of expected it to be so quickly in the new year. Now that that's happened, obviously, you mentioned it, Vashi. I mean, you know, obviously the PQ is leading in the polls. You've got the Liberal Party in big trouble right now with, you know, without a leader, quite frankly, since Pablo Rodriguez left. And now at La CAQ, the big problem with La CAQ is who is going to succeed François Legault. If you look at the potential candidates that may succeed him, nobody has got the gravitas or the presence that François Legault has. And so there's been a lot of talk at La CAQ over the last couple of months that, you know, they're maybe looking for lightning in a bottle, the sort of way that would happen in Ottawa about a year ago, exactly a year ago, whereby you had an extremely unpopular prime minister who quit, and then someone came in and against all odds ended up winning the election. Will that happen with the CAQ? I doubt it very much unless somebody comes on a white horse that we can't think of right now that could really move the dial. But I think what this does is probably reinforces the PQ going into the election, because let's not forget, I mean, you know, Coalition Avenir Québec is a coalition. And so you got a lot of PQ members there. You got a lot of Liberal members in the, or at least Liberal militants and PQ militants in the Coalition Avenir Québec. And clearly, with the PQ leading in the polls, you can bet that a lot of people in La CAQ that came from the PQ are probably going to go back to the PQ. And so what I think the dynamic that this sort of signals is that the PQ is probably going to pick up support as a result of this.
So, Sebastian, let me put that to you. I mean, it's not just this that's happened. A few weeks ago, it was the leader, as both Louis and Dimitri referenced, of the Liberals, Pablo Rodriguez, who quit. So two parties, 8 months out or 9 months out from an election, are now facing a leadership challenge. In most places, I would say that's a very dynamic situation where basically you think at this point anything can happen. Is that true in Quebec?
Well, you can add to the fact that Québec Solidaire also just recently went through a leadership race of their own and has been going through internal turmoil. The party that forms the third opposition, the PQ, which so means small caucus, is now way ahead in the polls, but they're running on the promise of a referendum, which is not that popular with a lot of voters, including some of their own. So as Louis mentioned, there could be a transfer between different parties. But at the end of the day, the name of the game right now is uncertainty, because it could move in many different directions. We'll see who become the new leaders. But in many ways, Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon benefited from being the new face in Quebec politics. But now you will have multiple new faces in a completely different environment and the referendum front and center. So things will change pretty drastically in Quebec politics over coming months, and we'll see what happens. But the PQ is in good standing right now. Will they be in good standing? Possibly, but a lot of question marks.
Yeah, Dimitri, no shortage of new faces. How dynamic do you think the situation is?
Oh, I think the political landscape has completely shifted. I would offer a different perspective. If you actually look at public opinion polls, what you will also notice is that favorability is on the decline for the PQ leader, and his negatives are rising. So at this point, quite frankly, nobody can predict what comes next. There is a path to victory for all three parties, for the Liberals, for the PQ, and for La CAQ. And we see a Conservative Party of Quebec that is also rising to the point where they may be able to win 5 to 10 seats, which then means it may end up being a minority government with the Conservative Party of Quebec holding the balance of power. This is a replay of exactly what happened in Ottawa. And so for the Parti Québécois, and especially its leader, the terrain just became far less comfortable because the anti-Legault vote, the villain, no longer has a single focal point. So the path to power now becomes more complex. Why? Because they had built so much momentum against an individual who is no longer there. I'm sure this all sounds familiar to you, Vashi. More broadly, Quebec politics right now, yes, you are right, enters a moment of uncertainty because coalitions are going to shift and everybody has to rewrite their narrative. All the opposition parties had to do during the next campaign were to say, we are not François Legault. Well, guess what? He's no longer there.
Last word to you, Louis. What does this all do to the question of separation?
Well, that's a tough one, quite frankly, because obviously, people want change in Quebec. People are looking to the PQ. I mean, everybody's sort of chimed in on this, but not many people want a referendum, quite frankly. They want change. The PQ seems to be the change solution. But people don't want a referendum, and so it's going to be extremely complicated and extremely interesting to watch. As far as I'm concerned, I don't think this really does anything, quite frankly, for the separation issue in Quebec. I think Quebecers still don't want a referendum on separation or not going to vote for it. And whether François Legault stays there, whether somebody comes in and replaces François Legault that people happen to like and they even win the election, I mean, it's just not going to change much in terms of the referendum question, I don't think.
Okay, I'm going to leave it on that note. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the discussion. Sebastien Dallaire, Dimitri Soudis, and Louis Hammond, our front bench tonight. We're going to take a quick commercial break, but on the other end of that break, provincial neighbours at odds over liquor sales. Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew will make his case for Crown Royal to Doug Ford. Live on this program next. Stay right there. The Premier is my next guest.
I talk to Wab frequently. I just got off the phone with him probably an hour ago. He did tell me he's going up to the Crown Royal plant, and I told him, God bless him. He's doing his job. He's trying to protect jobs in Manitoba. I'm protecting jobs here in Ontario, and he respects that. I respect him. We have a phenomenal relationship.
Are you still planning on taking Crown Royal off the shelves?
Sure as I'm talking to you, that Crown Royal is coming off the shelves.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford says he likes his provincial neighbour, Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew, a lot, but he's still pulling Manitoba-made Crown Royal off liquor store shelves in his province, all over the shuttering of an Ontario bottling plant by the foreign-owned company behind the liquor. Premier Kinew is still making his case. He joins us live now from Winnipeg. Hi, Premier. It's a pleasure to see you. Thank you very much for making the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Just before I get into the Crown Royal stuff, I did want to ask you, you've sat around the table with Premier Legault now for a number of years, just for your reaction to his resignation.
Well, it was a surprise. We've definitely been there through some interesting times, particularly with Trudeau's resignation a year ago through the Trump tariff threats, but also just as the leader of a bilingual province like Manitoba, being able to speak French around the table, maybe that's something that allowed Monsieur Legault and I to be able to strike up a relationship. So I certainly wish him and Isabelle all the best in what's next. He's made his mark on Quebec and Canadian politics, and I thank him for his public service.
All right, on to, as promised, what's going on with Crown Royal. If I understood the back and forth kind of yesterday, there was the possibility of another conversation between yourself and the Ontario Premier, where you said you would, you intended to try and convince him to change his mind. Has that conversation taken place, and do you have any optimism that you will be able to?
Haven't had that conversation yet. I am optimistic. I invited Doug Ford to the Winnipeg Jets versus Toronto Maple Leafs hockey game that's happening here in Winnipeg on the weekend. And I made him the offer, we can sort this out and watch some hockey. The funny thing about us showing down over Crown Royal is that neither of us drink alcohol. So, we could be there at the Jets game with our Diet Cokes in hand, talking about how we're going to protect the jobs at the distillery here in Gimli, Manitoba, which is kind of an odd sight. But here we are in politics in 2026. So what I'd say to Mr. Ford, it's my buddy Doug, is yesterday I was in Gimli. I met a guy there, born and raised Canadian, goes to work wearing a high-vis vest each and every day, the same type of person who elected each of us. He's been working at the Crown Royal plant in Gimli, Manitoba for 50 years. That's not just a job, that's a career. And that's the type of person that you're going to hurt if you follow through on what you've been saying. So I am optimistic, Vashi, that we'll be able to work through this. I don't expect that, having one press conference is going to get, Premier Ford to change direction. But I am going to keep working on him. And I think in time, we'll be able to get to a good solution here.
And I totally understand the incentive for wanting that to take place and for the workers who work at that at the plant that you reference. Should the request, though, really be, at the end of the day, to the company, to Diageo, who's decided to make this move ultimately that ended up prompting a reaction from Doug Ford? Like, isn't the problem the company moving any operation in Canada to the U.S. versus a premier responding to that?
Well, certainly, if Diageo supports Ontario workers, I'm all for it. But are you going to help Ontario workers by hurting Manitoba workers? That's the question that we're confronted with this political issue. And taking LCBO, products off the shelves, a big billion-dollar foreign-owned business, they're going to be just fine. But who's actually going to be hurt by this? It's people in a community that started as a fishing village that is now a tourist destination. And by the way, they have the Crown Royal Distillery in town. Hardworking, blue-collar Manitobans. That's who's going to feel the pain here. And so I'm all for standing up for Ontario workers, but let's not shoot ourselves in the foot while we're at it. There's no sense saying that this Canadian worker's job requires us to hurt another Canadian worker's job. And that's really fundamentally the case that I'm making here. I'm all for having a united front against Donald Trump alongside Premier Ford. I'm all for having a united front towards Diageo alongside Premier Ford. But this is not the way to do it. Let's make sure that we're protecting Manitoba jobs and Canadian jobs. And let's get on to the business of standing together as Team Canada to protect workers in all of our provinces.
Is there a direct line, do you believe, or do you have evidence to show that if ultimately Doug Ford does follow through, the Premier does follow through with this and remove Crown Royal from the LCBO, that workers, for example, in Gimli will be laid off, or that operations in Manitoba will be affected, and to what degree?
Well, I think whiskey politics is just like booze politics. We as Canadians, and I did this along with Premier Ford, premiers in other provinces, we removed American booze from the shelves. Of all the things we've done, this is one of the things that Canada has taken action on that the Trump administration has noticed. And that's because there's an economic value, there's also a symbolic value. And so here in Canada, the same holds true. This is something that has a real economic impact. And when you're talking about a small community in Gimli, Manitoba, in a rural region called the Interlake, and you're talking about hitting those jobs, it just doesn't make sense. It's not the type of thing that's in keeping with our Team Canada approach right now. We want to get major projects built. We want to trade products, including alcohol, across our provincial borders. I signed an MOU with Doug Ford last year about interprovincial trade that included considerations about alcohol. So again, this is all about making sure that we stick together here. And when you're talking about who's going to feel the impact here, I'm sure that the big businesses are going to be fine. I'm sure that the politicians are even going to be fine. But at the end of the day, it's about the workers and standing up for them. So I'm all for standing up for employees at an Ontario bottling plant, but you can't do it at the expense of the workers in Manitoba at the distillery. So let's work together. Let's find another path forward here. And, the thing about working with Premier Ford is I recognize that he's going to talk the way that he is. He's talked tough. He's talked about himself into a certain position, talked himself up onto a ledge. We can't let him jump. We've got to give him an opportunity to talk his way down from that ledge. And so I don't expect that the situation will get resolved overnight, but I do know that if we give a win, give a path forward, call it what you will, and we keep just making the case that this is not where you want to take your fight. You don't want to take your fight to a place that is going to harm salt of the earth, blue-collar Canadians. I'm sure Mr. Ford will come around to the place that we want to get him to.
Premier, I just have one more question for you because I only have about 2 minutes left, and I did want to get you on something that the Prime Minister's trip to China, because following our interview a few months ago with the Chinese ambassador, you wrote a letter to him essentially advocating for this kind of quid pro quo, remove EV tariffs so that canola and pork tariffs, which affect your province very greatly, can be removed, as China basically laid out would be the case. Are you worried, if that does end up being something that materializes during this trip, about the precedent that would create and the degree to which China would feel like it could exacerbate our vulnerabilities? Or exploit is a better word.
You're describing negotiations since the beginning of time, right? I mean, what did Mr. Trump say yesterday about Kuzma? He's talking tough about Kuzma, presumably because he wants to put us on the back foot heading into the review. So we as Canadians, when it comes to Mr. Trump, we got to be able to be on the lead foot. We got to, have a good base underneath us as we head into those negotiations. But I assume that the reason the government of Canada put these tariffs on China on in the first place was to have leverage in the negotiation realm. So now that Mr. Carney is heading to China, I'm asking him to negotiate. Use the leverage that you have to give us relief in the pork sector. Give us relief in the canola sector. Some context for your listeners, for your viewers rather. The ag sector is twice the size of what the auto sector is to our Canadian economy. When you're looking at the value-added manufacturing, it's an order of magnitude larger than the auto sector is. And as I said earlier, I'm all for workers in Ontario. I'm all for workers in the auto sector. But we in the Western Canadian economy are making huge contributions to Canada's overall GDP. And I'm strongly encouraging Mr. Carney to find a path forward here to get the tariffs lifted on the products that we create and export, and to open up markets to the world's second largest economy for our exports in a way, and this is where it always gets interesting and complicated, in a way that doesn't compromise our ability to export to the world's largest economy south of the border.
I will leave it on that complex note. Thanks so much, Premier. Appreciate your time as always.
Thank
Manitoba
you.
Premier Wab Kinew. We'll be right back after a short break.
Mr. President, on Iran, you said that the killing has stopped. Who told you that the killings have stopped there?
We have been informed by very important sources on the other side, and they've said the killing has stopped and the executions won't take place.
Does this mean military action is now off the table against Iran?
We're going to watch and see what the process is, but we were given a very good statement by people that are aware of what's going on.
U.S. President Donald Trump's latest comments this afternoon on the situation unfolding in Iran and the possibility of U.S. military intervention. He certainly dialed down the rhetoric or even the possibility of that during those comments. But I would note there are multiple reports tonight that Iran has temporarily closed its airspace to all flights except approved international civil arrivals and departures. That is, again, being reported by multiple media outlets around the world. What that means exactly for the possibility of something from the U.S. or otherwise, we watch and see. I will leave Power Play there. I'm Vashi Kapelos. Thanks for watching tonight. Have a good one.